Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping straight into a seriously fascinating piece of mythological source material today. We're going to unpack some ancient yet incredibly timeless truths about power, duty, and, honestly, the terrifyingly heavy price of just staying silent. We're looking at exactly what happens to a society when a ruler completely oversteps their bounds and what that means for the everyday people caught in the crossfire. So, let's dive right in. The dialogue kicks off with this incredibly striking moral baseline. It states, "The child who remains silent at their parents' suffering is unworthy and actionless." Wow, that just immediately plunges us into the deep end, right into the dilemma of inaction. The text isn't just saying, hey, silence is unhelpful. No, it's framing silence in the face of suffering as a massive, fundamental failure of duty. It basically asks us to look right at our immediate family unit first, before we even start expanding this idea out to the rest of society.
Section 1. The heavy cost of silence. When inaction becomes complicity.
Let's really unpack what it means to just turn a blind eye to suffering. The text doesn't frame silence as some kind of neutral, safe middle ground where you can just stay out of trouble. Not at all. It actually defines being unworthy and actionless as a grave moral failing. Think about it. When you see your own family or your own people suffering and you choose to do absolutely nothing, to say nothing, you aren't just a bystander anymore. The source strongly suggests that this kind of silence is literally a form of complicity. It strips away your worth. It strips away your agency. It's a very stark, challenging concept, isn't it? It forces us to ask, at what exact point does refusing to speak up actually make us part of the problem?
Moving into Section 2, Attack on Education and Dharma, the disruption of knowledge by tyranny.
So how does absolute tyranny actually operate? Well, it strikes right at the beating heart of society, education. We see this incredibly stark contrast. On one hand, you have the ideal state, daytime normalcy, where students can just sit, learn in peace, and have stability. But then you have the grim reality of the text. The source describes how this great devoted teacher, Rishi Jamadagni, is actually forced to teach his students in the dead of night. And why? Because the tyrannical king, Sahasrarjuna, literally refuses to let students settle in one place during the day. He's just constantly uprooting and terrorizing them. So the teacher has to instruct in complete darkness just to make up for those lost daylight hours. It perfectly illustrates how tyranny doesn't just wage war with armies. It actively attacks the very foundation of learning.
And the psychological toll here? It is absolutely immense. Teachers are fearful. Students are completely terrorized. The entire focus on education is just shattered. I mean, think about it. When your mind is totally consumed by fear, by the constant threat of a tyrant, how are you supposed to focus on learning anything? It's like trying to build a solid foundation for a house right in the middle of a massive earthquake. It's just not going to happen. The situation described here becomes so incredibly dire that even the divine observers watching from above, the figures who are supposed to oversee the balance of the universe, they feel this profound, deeply unsettling sense of helplessness. They're watching the hope of the future get crushed, but they're bound by cosmic rules from just swooping in and intervening directly.
Which brings us to Section 3. Circumstances and the Helpless Warrior. The tragic transformation of Parashuram.
Now we get into this fascinating character study of how dark, oppressive circumstances can completely hijack a person's destiny. We're looking at a devastating contrast in the life of Parashuram. The source heavily emphasizes what he was actually born for. He was meant to be a scholar, a guru, an acharya, someone whose whole purpose was to spread knowledge and wisdom and peace for the benefit of everyone. But then you look at what he is forced to be. Because of the sheer terror unleashed by this tyrant king, this man of peace is backed into a corner by his environment and forced to become a warrior. He has to take up arms simply because the circumstances make peace totally impossible.
And that leads us to what is basically the emotional core of our explainer today. The text states, instead of a book to distribute knowledge, circumstances forced a bow and arrow into both his hands. Wow. That just perfectly captures the deep melancholy of a peaceful destiny that gets entirely corrupted by systemic terror. The divine dialogue really laments this tragedy. Just imagine hands that were literally meant to generously distribute the light of wisdom, now forced to grip weapons of war. It's a really profound commentary on how toxic environments and tyrannical leadership don't just oppress people physically. They literally force good, peaceful people to completely abandon their true nature just to survive and fight back.
Moving on to Section 4. The true duty of power. The delusion of absolute rule.
So how does all of this build into a critique of the root cause of the suffering? It really comes down to the arrogance of power. You see, to make life peaceful and happy, the divine forces in this mythology didn't just dump humanity on Earth and say good luck. They actually set up boundaries. They sent down the Vedas and Shastras, these ancient texts of wisdom, as guiding principles. They lit thousands of lamps of knowledge to show the way. They defined the natural boundaries of life, and most importantly, they established crystal-clear principles for both the rulers and the subjects. These aren't just polite suggestions, they are the literal framework for a healthy society. A society where education can actually thrive and people can safely live out their true destinies.
But of course, here is where the friction happens. The dialogue notes that the ordinary citizens, the common, everyday people, they're actually doing their part. They continue to respect these boundaries and follow the rules. But King Sahasrarjuna, the very person at the absolute top, he completely ignores them. The entire system just totally breaks down when the ruler himself, the one who is explicitly meant to uphold the law and protect his people, starts treating these sacred boundaries like they just don't apply to him at all.
There's a very stark political and philosophical contrast being made here between a servant ruler and an autocratic master. A true ruler acts as a protector, right? They serve the public's best interests, and they actually respect those divine principles we just talked about. But Sahasrarjuna falls into an incredibly dangerous delusion. He becomes the autocratic master. He starts to actually believe he isn't just a leader, but the absolute owner of the people. So instead of serving the public, he's only serving his own ego. And crucially, whenever he hits a principle or a boundary, he doesn't see it as a necessary guidepost for a healthy society. No, he views it as an annoying restriction that he just has to break to prove he's the boss. And that shift, from a king remembering he is a public servant to deluding himself into acting like an unquestionable master, that is exactly what unleashes the care that forces scholars to become warriors.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought from today's analysis. Based on everything we've unpacked from this powerful dialogue, the destruction of education, the forced changing of destinies, the massive delusion of absolute power, we really have to ask ourselves, when a ruler forgets he is a servant and becomes an absolute tyrant, is your silence merely a personal choice, or does it actually become a sin? It's a remarkably heavy question about duty, action, and complicity. I want you to really reflect upon that until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.